The door has been open since 1946. I need you to hear that sentence before anything else, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. A door between this reality and something adjacent to it, something that has been pressing against the boundary for longer than recorded human history, has been open continuously for 80 years. And the people who know about it have not been trying to close it. They have been managing what comes through. I am sitting in the Manticore's communications bay. It is 214 hours. I have been here for 6 hours and I have not moved because what I found in the archive 20 minutes into my shift has made movement feel irrelevant. My hands are steady. I want to document that. My hands are steady, and my thinking is clear, and what I am about to tell you is not the product of isolation or stress, or the particular madness that deep space does to a person after long enough. This is primary documentation, classified files, internal government records that were placed on this vessel by someone who had access to them and wanted them preserved. And what they describe is this. In 1946, a man named Jack Parsons, mathematician, rocket engineer, co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, performed a ritual in a house in Pasadena, California. The ritual opened a door. Parsons died 6 years later in an explosion in his laboratory before he could close it. And 80 years since, the people who inherited his work have not been trying to close it either. They have been briefing past us. My name is Captain Arthur Vance, Deep Space Vessel Manticore. And I need to tell you everything. I need to start in 1946, not 1947, not Roswell, not the Cold War, which is where most people start when they are trying to map the official history of classified contact. In 1946, a man named Jack Parsons. If you know that name at all, you know it from the history of American rocketry, co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, one of the architects of the modern space program, a man whose mathematics helped put the first satellites into orbit, a man who, by any reasonable measure, helped build the infrastructure that eventually produced this vessel. What the official history omits is what Parsons was doing in the Pasadena house he called the Parsonage, and months before his death, he was performing a ritual, not alone. Ron Hubbard, who would later found Scientology, and a small group of people whose names the archive lists, under a designation I have seen before in other documents, Collins Elite. The ritual was called Babylon Working, an attempt to open a dimensional doorway. Not a metaphor, not a psychological exercise, not the kind of esoteric symbolism that fills the occult writings of that period. An actual attempt, using specific frequencies, specific geometric configurations, a theoretical framework that the archive's technical appendix describes in language that makes my hands cold to read. Because the theoretical framework is the same framework Manticore's navigation systems used to locate the cathedral bearing 274, the same mathematics, the same frequency structures. Parsons' ritual and the route to whatever is out there at 274, they are built from the same equations. I have checked this 3 times. The connection is not ambiguous. Here is what the archive says happened next. And I am going to document this carefully because I want you to hear the difference between what the official record says and what is actually in these files. The Babylon Working produced a result, not the result Parsons intended. He was attempting to summon what the Thelemic tradition calls the Scarlet Woman, an elemental force, a conceptual entity, something that exists in the space between symbol and reality. Crowley's system. Thelemic cosmology. The kind of thing that most people in 2026 read as elaborate metaphor produced by a very strange man in the early 20th century. Parsons did not read it as metaphor. He read it as technical specification, and whatever he was doing, something responded, not a Scarlet Woman. Something the Collins elite spent the next 4 decades trying to classify and contain. Something the FBI's internal documents, the same documents referenced as File 6751 in the archive, described not as extraterrestrial, but as interdimensional, not from another planet, from another layer of reality, something that had been waiting on the other side of a specific vibrational threshold for a very long time, waiting for someone to open the door from this side. Parsons opened it, and then Parsons died. An explosion in his home laboratory in 1952 officially ruled an accident, with timing that the archive's internal analysis describes, in very careful bureaucratic language, as statistically inconsistent with coincidence. He died before he could close it, and the door has been open ever since. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it is easy to hear those words and file them under conspiracy theory and move on. I understand the impulse. I have spent 22 years training myself to resist exactly this kind of reasoning, the kind that starts from a conclusion and works backward, that finds patterns because it is looking for them, that mistakes correlation for mechanism. But I am not working backward from a conclusion. I am reading primary documents, internal government documents, files that were classified above top secret for 8 decades, files that were placed in this vessel's archive by someone who had access to them and wanted them preserved, and what they describe is internally consistent in a way that I cannot dismiss. Parsons opened a door in 1946. The door produced something that the Collins elite spent decades investigating. The Collins elite concluded that the entities coming through the door are not extraterrestrial. They are interdimensional. They have been interacting with humanity under different names across the full span of recorded history. Angels, demons, gods, spirits, the Nephilim, the Watchers, different labels, different cultural frameworks, same phenomenon, and the door has been open for 80 years. I want to be precise about what it means to say the door has been opened since 1946. It does not mean nothing was there before. The archive is clear on that. The entities the Collins elite investigated were not created by Parsons. He did not summon something into existence. He opened a boundary that already existed. The adjacent layer was always there. The entities were always there. What 1946 changed is access. Before Parsons, the boundary was permeable only under very specific conditions, conditions that occurred rarely and briefly. Certain ritual configurations, certain geographic locations, certain temporal coordinates. The encounters that fill the historical record, visions, apparitions, moments of contact that lasted seconds or hours and then closed. After Parsons, the boundary stayed open. The access became persistent, and persistent access changed everything, because an entity that can only reach through for moments behaves differently from an entity that has a standing connection. The Collins elite spent decades documenting what that difference looks like. The detailed reports are in the archive. I have read most of them. What they describe is a shift from sporadic, event-based contact to something more like infrastructure. The entities did not just appear and disappear after 1946. They started building systems, networks, relationships with specific individuals in specific institutions, long-term projects that required sustained access over years. The Harvest is one of those projects. The classified programs, the briefing networks, the management of disclosure, those are others. The door being open did not just give them access to us, it gave them time. Let me tell you about the physics, because I know how this sounds, and I know what it needs to sound like to be taken seriously. And the physics are actually there if you know where to look. Quantum field theory, the standard framework for understanding subatomic reality, describes the world as fundamentally a field of probabilities. Things do not have definite states until they are observed. They exist in superposition, multiple possibilities simultaneously, until the act of measurement collapses them into a single outcome. The Copenhagen interpretation, which is the standard teaching version, treats the collapse as final. The other possibilities simply stop existing. The many worlds interpretation says they do not. It says the other possibilities continue to exist in branching parallel realities that never interact with each other. But there is a third model, one that appears in the classified appendices of the archive, now that I have not seen in any published literature. This model describes reality as a layered structure, not parallel branches that never interact. Stacked layers with permeable boundaries at specific resonance frequencies. The boundaries are normally impermeable, under specific conditions, specific geometric configurations, specific frequency combinations, specific points of coherent intentional focus supplied at the right temporal coordinates. The boundaries become temporarily permeable. Temporarily, unless the opening is sustained, unless someone, deliberately or accidentally, maintains the resonance condition that keeps the boundary open. Jack Parsons opened a door in 1946. The people who inherited his work have been maintaining that door ever since, not because they want what comes through it, because they do not know how to close it. That distinction matters more than anything else in this file. The Collins Elite. The archive has a full dossier, and reading it is one of the stranger experiences I have had on this vessel, which is saying something. Established in the early 1950s as a classified working group with a mandate that was specifically distinct from Project Blue Book and from the MJ-12 program, if MJ-12 is real, which the archive treats as a settled question. Blue Book was public-facing. It existed to explain UFO sightings away, to provide official, mundane explanations for things that the people reporting them knew were not mundane. Must by, assuming the documents are authentic, was more serious. It was tasked with managing contact, reverse engineering recovered vehicles, understanding the technology. The Collins Elite was different from both. It had one question, not where do these entities come from, what are they? The distinction seems subtle until you understand what it implies. The where question assumes physical origin. It assumes a planet, a star system, a journey across space. It assumes something that, however advanced, is operating within the same physical universe we inhabit. The what question does not make that assumption. And Collins Elite, after decades of investigation, after interviewing hundreds of contactees and experiencers, after analyzing recovered biological material, after cross-referencing the phenomenology of encounters across cultures and centuries, the Collins Elite concluded that the where question was the wrong question. The entities are not extraterrestrial. They are not physical beings that evolved on another planet and developed technology to cross interstellar space. They are entities that exist in the adjacent reality layer that Parsons' ritual made accessible. entities that have been aware of the human species for a very long time, that have been interacting with us under different names and different appearances across the full span of recorded history, that present themselves differently depending on the expectations of the observer. In a medieval context, they appear as angels and demons. In a post-Enlightenment context, they appear as extraterrestrials. In a post-Roswell context, they appear as grey aliens in recovered vehicles. The form changes, the phenomenon does not. Crowley said it directly, in a quote the archive highlights, with a classification marker I have not seen in other documents. Today they call them angels and demons. Tomorrow they will call them something else. He was right. We call them something else. We are still calling them something else. He died before he could close it, and the door has been open ever since. I want to tell you something about Parsons that is not in the official history, and that I have been sitting with since I read it. He knew, not fully, not in the way I know now, after the DNA report and the archive and the notation this morning, but he knew something was wrong with what he would done. The archive has fragments of his personal correspondence from the months between the working and his death, letters to people whose names are redacted, technical notes that his colleagues described as increasingly incoherent, but that the archive's analysts decoded as increasingly precise. He was trying to close it. He did not have the mathematics to do it. He had the mathematics to open the door. Whether he understood exactly what he was doing is a question the archive treats as open, but the closing operation is more complex. It requires knowledge that Parsons did not have. He was working toward it. 6 years of trying to reconstruct from first principles what a closing operation would require. And then the explosion in the laboratory in 1952. The archive's reconstruction of the blast pattern suggests it originated in a section of the lab where Parsons had been running experiments on frequency cancellation. He was that close. And then he was not. I have thought about Parsons a lot in the last 6 hours. A man who opened something he could not close, who spent the rest of his short life trying to fix it, who was removed before he could. The parallel to Amy Eskridge is not subtle. The parallel to Object 6, 7751, is not subtle either. Everyone who gets close to the mechanism and tries to work against it ends up the same way, except the people transmitting into recorders, except the logs. I do not know if that is a coincidence. I do not think it is. I need to tell you about Greg Rinride. The archive's dossier on Rinride is incomplete. Several sections have been redacted, even at my clearance level, which tells me there is a classification above SETAF that I have not encountered yet. That thought is not comforting. What remains is sufficient. Rinride was a lieutenant colonel with access to underground facilities that the archive identifies as S4, a sublevel of a classified installation in Nevada that you may know by other names, and a facility in Dulce, New Mexico. Dulce, I need to stop there for a moment. The public record on Dulce is a mixture of conspiracy theory, deliberate disinformation, and what I now believe are genuine leaked fragments from people who saw something they could not process and described it the only way they could. The archive's description of the Dulce facility is different from what I have seen in the public record. It is clinical. It is methodical. It reads like a building inspection report, written by someone who has stopped being surprised by what they are inspecting. Underground levels. Multiple what the report calls biological classifications. Research operations that the archive describes in terms I am going to document very carefully because the implications are significant. And in the deepest level, a level that required a separate security clearance from the one that granted Rinride access to S4, entities that did something unexpected. They identified themselves. Voluntarily, they told him what they were. They called themselves the Nephilim, not as a religious reference, not as a metaphor, as a designation, a name they had been using for themselves for longer than the human civilization that coined the term had existed. And then they told him what they were preparing for, an interspecies conflict, not with humanity, with something else, something they described as the original architect of the dimensional structure, the entity or entities whose existence the archive references in a single phrase that I had to read twice before I believed I was reading it correctly. The Nephilim in that facility, in the deepest level, in the clinical fluorescent underground of Dulce, New Mexico. They believe they are going to win. I do not know what that means for us. I do not think Riot did either. I keep returning to the pastors. The decision to brief religious leaders specifically, people whose entire framework for understanding reality already includes the category of interdimensional non-human entities, that is not a random choice. Whoever organized those briefings or thought carefully about their audience, the general population, if you polled them, would sort non-human intelligences into two categories: alien, extraterrestrial, physical, from somewhere in space, or fictional. Those are the available boxes. That is what 80 years of official dismissal and deliberate misframing has produced. Neither of those boxes fits what the Collins elite concluded. But religious communities already have a third box. They have always had it. Angels that are not gods, but are also not human. Watchers who descended and interfered. Nephilim, who are the product of that interference. Principalities and powers that operate in a realm adjacent to, but distinct from physical reality. That box fits the Collins elite's conclusion precisely. So the pastors were chosen not because they are more credible, not because they have scientific authority, because they already have the vocabulary. And when the disclosure comes, whatever form it takes, a population that has already been told by their pastor that this is what the texts always described, just under a different name, is a population that has somewhere to put the information. A population that does not have somewhere to put it is a population in framework crisis. Framework crisis, at scale, is what the briefing was designed to prevent. I think that is genuinely the motive. I think the people running those briefings believe they are doing the responsible thing. What I do not think is that the responsible thing and the honest thing are the same in this case. The architects communicated again this morning, not the way they communicated in the previous log, not the direct transmission, meaning arriving without mechanism, where your dream arrives. Something different, a notation on my terminal. Not a file, not a transferred document. 3 lines, in the same degraded script as the recovered personal effects of objects 6751. The script the lexicon can partially translate. I spent 40 minutes working through it. This is what it says. The door Parsons opened is not the only door. Every ritual in every century that used the correct frequency configuration opened a door. What you call history is largely a record of what came through. And then a 4th line that I translated last. The faction does not want the door closed. The door is how they feed. I have been sitting with that for 2 hours. The faction. I have been using that word throughout this mission to describe the group within the Nephilim, the ones driving the harvest, the ones who split from the architects at the moment of the division, the ones who have been working through the classified programs and the Collins elite and the briefing networks to shape how humanity receives the disclosure. The notation says the door is how they feed. This connects to something in the DNA report that I have been circling without fully landing on. Object 6751 Civilization. The descendants of humans who survived the harvests underground for 40,000 years. They sent agents backward through time carrying a drawing, a figure looking up. 3 words. Keep looking up. I have been reading that as an instruction to maintain the observer capacity, to keep asking questions, to keep documenting. But there is a second layer. If the faction feeds through the door, if the specific resonance condition that keeps the boundary permeable is maintained by human attention oriented in a particular way, then the observer capacity is not just about documentation. It is about orientation. A mind oriented upward, genuinely upward, toward whatever is actually there rather than toward the managed presentation of what is there, is a mind that it is not feeding the door. The faction does not need you to believe in them specifically. A full synchrophorency, oriented towards a boundary, generating the resonance that keeps it permeable. And they have spent 80 years building the cultural infrastructure to ensure that when the disclosure comes, when the boundary becomes undeniable, human attention orients toward it in exactly the way that maintains the frequency. The pastors were briefed to prepare their congregations for contact. But contact with what? Framed how? Interpreted through whose vocabulary? The faction's vocabulary, provided in advance, through the trusted channels, so that when the door is fully open, and what comes through is no longer deniable, the human population receives it inside a framework that keeps the frequency stable. That keeps them feeding the door, without knowing that is what they are doing. Here is what I know, and what I am still working out. The door has been open since 1946, possibly longer. The architect's notation says Parsons was not the first. He just used a version of the equations that worked at a scale and coherence level that previous attempts had not reached. The Collins elite knew this by the late 1950s. They spent decades investigating it and reached conclusions that were classified above the level of the programs working on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Rinwright encountered the entities directly and was told things that the archive treats as significant enough to redact even at serif clearance. The architects on this vessel separated from the faction at the moment of the division. They had been waiting, in pods, in the cold gold light of compartment 00, for something. I think they were waiting for the sequence, for the file to be found, for the connections to be made, for someone with SERF clearance on a vessel with the right hardware key to put it together and transmit it. That is what this log is. I do not know who receives it. I do not know if what I am transmitting reaches anyone before the disclosure happens. The archive's estimate of the timeline was imminent. That word was used in documents from 3 different decades, which either means the timeline has been extended repeatedly, or imminence means something different to the faction than it does to us. What I know is that the door can be closed. Not by the person who opened it, Parsons is gone, by a sufficient concentration of minds oriented away from the frequency. The same resonance logic that keeps the door open can close it. If enough people stop maintaining the signal, stop feeding the frequency, stop being tuned, unknowingly, to the carrier wave of something that has been using human attention as fuel for longer than human civilization has existed. I do not know how many people that requires. The archive does not specify. The theoretical framework describes a threshold, a minimum concentration of dissonant minds, but the number is not given. Maybe it cannot be given. Maybe it is dynamic. Maybe friends and variables I do not have access to from this communications bay, on this vessel, 40,000 kilometers from the nearest human being. What I know is that every mind that asks the right question, is a mind that is not feeding the door. And the right question is not what are they, or where are they from, or what does the disclosure mean. The right question is the one the pastor asked in the briefing: what do they want? Follow that question wherever it goes. Do not let anyone tell you it is not today's topic. It is always today's topic. It is the only topic that matters. This is what I know. This is what I am transmitting. This is what the architects in compartment 0Z0 have been waiting for me to put together and send out into whatever is listening. The door has been open since 1946. The observer capacity, the specific neurological configuration of a mind that looks up, asks questions, and transmits what it finds. That capacity is not just about knowledge. It is about frequency. A mind genuinely oriented toward truth, not toward the managed presentation of truth, not toward the framework provided in advance, generates a different signal than a mind consuming the disclosure inside the faction's vocabulary. That different signal is what keeps the bridge open, not the bridge to the outer dark. The other bridge, the one that Object 6,751's civilization spent 40,000 years trying to reach. The architects are in compartment 0Z0. They have been standing in their pods since they woke. They have been watching the direction of the communications bay. They know I found the file. I think they knew I would find it. I think the sequence of revelations on this vessel, the DNA report, the Manticore protocol, the notation this morning, the pastoral briefing file, is not accidental. It is deliberate. The architects have been feeding information into my path in an order that makes the connections clear. I do not know why. I do not know what they need from me. But I know what they left in the notation. The door has been open since 1946. Parsons opened it. The faction has been maintaining it. The harvest is the current mechanism, and doors can be closed. Captain Arthur Vance, Deep Space Vessel Manticore. The door has been open since 1946, but doors can be closed. Keep asking questions. Captain's log, entry 24. End of transmission.